Thank you so much. Yes, I hope that some of the questions that were raised earlier, that some of you who asked those are still here. I offer some potential answers to this figure ground problem and the peculiar formal aspects of some of Stubbs's painting that I believe are strongly rooted in sort of simply his way of producing them, having not so much to do with a stylistic decision as a result of particular ways he goes about painting. Obviously, I want to start by thanking the organizers of today for the invitation, to Anthony Spira, Paul Bonaventura, and Martin Possel for approaching me about speaking, especially as I'm a bit of an interloper, in Stubbs. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to think a little bit more about some issues of interest to me through Stubbs's work. Maybe. Let's see, there we are. So as you heard, I'm really more a specialist of continental and French art. And so I came to Stubbs actually through this very peculiar painting, which has long gone unaddressed and was little studied beyond Judy Egerton's excellent catalog entry. It is, to be sure, a curiosity, but also a kind of object lesson in issues of interest to me about workshop production, multiple hands, and division of or by genre, something that came up a couple talks ago as well with drapery painters. Visual analysis confirms the content of an 18th century label that was once affixed to the structure of this painting. Quote, "The horse was recently painted by George Stubbs in London, the background by Claude-Joseph Vernet, the celebrated marine painter and landscape painter, and the figure, the dogs, and the sheep are by Francois Boucher, principal painter to the King of France." The tightly knit strokes of the horse, in contrast with the looser blending of tones in the landscape and the sky, that come just short of meeting the animal's outline, resulting in a kind of halo that heightens the sense of the central element as the center of a kind of cutout affixed somewhat unconvincingly to the canvas. Then there are the most rapidly applied brushstrokes. These represent the figures, the human figures, the sheep and the dog, all cleverly folded into the landscape at a break between foreground and background. Stubbs's hollyhock, the horse at the center, originated around 1765 as the study of a yearling recently purchased by Frederick St. John, 2nd Viscount Bolingbroke. Oops, wrong direction. There we are. The reemergence of the only known example, I'm relying on the catalog, maybe there are even further developments since, from Stubbs's collection of preparatory drawings, very important to distinguish from the kinds of anatomical drawings you see downstairs. These were from his dispersed studio sale in 1807, and this one, of course, is in the exhibition, hints at the meticulous preparation that we've largely lost in terms of the historical record about this kind of working drawing. The second, a rare survival also on view, is this work I was really excited to see, preparatory for the painted horse at right. Stubbs focuses exclusively on the animal. This epitomizes how I see him thinking in parts. Given the present exhibition's focus on his anatomical work, it's tempting to make an analogy to anatomy and the tension between thinking and meticulously observing discrete parts, and then in turn, linking them, muscle to bone, organs to flesh, etc. From an art theory perspective, however, what Stubbs doesn't do is what many authors would have encouraged him and other painters to do. That is, thinking, for example, of various objects under a single light source, a key way that these objects are linked and unified on the canvas, or color juxtaposition, since of course we know that when one color appears next to another, both colors are impacted in terms of how they're perceived by the eye. So of course, unlike in the world in which juxtaposed objects will prompt those relationships in the viewer's eye, the eye combining them, on canvases, relationships are not just discrete objects that you can clump together and hope for that effect, but rather it's the illusion of shared space that the artist has to develop, and at times Stubbs doesn't do that. And at a concrete level, I think his working method allows little allowance for that kind of unification. And it results in the formal aspects we've noted, and also speaks wonderfully easily to certain aspects of neoclassicism, which he interestingly intersects with, and his empiricism intersects with. Stubbs's oil studies and technical analysis of related works brings us closest to understanding how a work like Hollyhock probably first appeared. Presumably, it was very similar to his studies Pangloss and Eclipse, the latter one on view, in which the horse was brought to a very high degree of finish, while the ground was left entirely unprepared. Stubbs could then employ such a study against grounds of his patron's choosing, as in his repetition of his finished study of Eclipse for Eclipse with William Wildman and his sons, dated around 1769, before using that same study much later, around 1794, for a painting of Eclipse at Newmarket, also on view here at Milton Keynes. The degree to which constituent parts were separable for various purposes is further indicated by Benjamin Green's print of this painting that included only Eclipse and John Wildman against another landscape. So you can choose your kind of component parts. Sorry for the kind of overlap of text there, I'm not sure what happened. Newmarket indeed served as one option for backgrounds for Stubbs, and images such as these indicate how backgrounds could work as kind of scrims. I think scrim is a useful kind of word when thinking about these being interchangeable parts depending on either Stubbs or his patron's wishes. Martin Myrone's catalog essay for this exhibition, I think, brilliantly cuts away at the various methods by which Stubbs has been reframed to modernize him, and this kind of image is precisely that, which without context, can read quite wonderfully as eerie, surreal, quite beautifully haunting. These are the kinds of words that are often used for this kind of painting. They are likely, however, best understood really as working tools or stages in his artistic practice. This kind of oil sketch, regularly used in large academic studios, frequently mistakenly read with a kind of post-romanticist sensibility, are comparable. They're very beautiful workshop tools, and we might think about the Van Eycken drapery painters who were mentioned a couple talks ago. In the French context that I know best, of course, it's a context obsessed with the hierarchy of genres, alerting us to also genre specialization. A drapery painter, such as the Van Eyckens, might be responsible for portions, in this case of Rigaud's sitters, while the master would have painted perhaps the face and hands, and indeed Stubbs's great counterpart in France, the animal painter Jean-Baptiste Oudry, allegedly found his genre when completing a dog and a hunt portrait for his master, Legillière. So he's working for Legillière, and Legillière observes of his painting, actually, you will become a great animal painter. The dog is better than the people. And this gets to some of the questions this morning, I think at least. As we know, in fact, Oudry's process was remarkably similar to Stubbs, figure and ground as separable, repeatable units, often resulting in jarring disconnection between the figures. Or, as here, the seeming lack of logical relationship between them, something evident in many Stubbs works that come off as a kind of pervasive stillness in which animals and even humans are kinds of objects placed atop the canvas. I think that the lack of recognition of the antelope for the dogs on the left, it really kind of underscores that. So you hope that the relationships will be imagined, but then they kind of fail when they actually are linked as individuated things. Of course, this painting, which it's so wonderful. This has something, almost brings a humor to that kind of sense of people and animals as a kind of object placed on the canvas. Of course, key threads of discussion are apparent in the Marquess of Rockingham's pictures, with the important prelude of Stubbs's exchange with Sir Joshua Reynolds, a man who is perhaps above all else known for his obsession with the hierarchy of genres, and who clearly keeps Stubbs in his place through a kind of backhanded flattery. Stubbs's first commission for a horse painting, it seems, after his arrival in London around 1759, was, quote, to paint a war horse for Reynolds. It's been suggested that his model, that this would have been the model for a portrait of Lord Lagnier. As Martin Postle notes, the functional role of Reynolds' request to Stubbs, the idea that it was with a purpose, it wasn't just to own this painting, but rather as a kind of working object, is supported by the fact that Reynolds returns that painting to Stubbs in exchange shortly thereafter for his more aspirant kind of subject matter, genre-wise, that of a history painting, The Fall of Phaeton. While we do not have, I think actually we might stay there. While we do not have Stubbs's original model for Reynolds, presumably lost since Stubbs's posthumous sale, we do have this painting. We do have his painting of Scrub and, of course, the famous Whistle Jacket, both portraits of animals owned by Rockingham that give a good sense of what kind of an unmounted horse like this that would be used as a future tool might look like, albeit an incredibly beautiful one. As Postel observes, the distinct contribution of figure and animal painters may have also occurred for a portrait of Reynolds, George Henry Lennox. Reynolds notes in his memorandum book, Mr. Stubbs' Lennox dog, to suggest that that he was responsible for only one portion. One of our most immediate sources on Stubbs, we've referred to this man quite often today, is Esaias Humphrey in his manuscript biography. Humphrey relays that the Rockingham family wished Whistlejacket to be, quote, represented by the best portrait painter and landscape background by the best artist in that branch of painting, so this faith in different genres. The hope there being a union of talents to possess a picture of the highest excellence. Stubbs's contemporaries were particularly harsh, in fact, on his ability to paint landscapes. In 1775, a critic wrote that Stubbs should either improve his skill in landscape or, quote, get somebody else to do them for him. In her catalogue of paintings at Castle Howard in 1837, the Countess of Carlisle described a painting that her husband had commissioned from Stubbs in 1773, and observed that Stubbs, quote, inability to paint landscape or to suffer any other artist to supply his defect, which had been requested, renders this piece less valuable. This provides a context for collaboration and Stubbs's own distinctions when thinking through the canvas in parts. As Stubbs reached the final stages of Whistlejacket, to quote Humphrey at, quote, the last sitting, or rather last standing, the horse responded so violently to the verisimilitude of his own likeness that he approached to attack and was calmed only by the stable boy's switch and Stubbs's own malstick. Quote, the Marquis came out shortly after to see what progress had been made, and learning the circumstances, was so pleased with such proof of excellence that was this picture that he determined nothing more should be done to it, though the bare canvas remained, the background remained a bare canvas. Art historians have, of course, been eager to read Rockingham's interest in classical sculpture as the motivating force behind the remarkable monochrome ground horse portraits, and certainly this frieze-like effect fits into that. I would reframe this slightly, not to say that that's not true, but that it's a slightly more complex thing. It seems to me that Rockingham's appreciation of classical sculpture was a condition that encouraged him to appreciate what was actually a step in Stubbs's already operative, even standard way of working. The role of the Rockingham group as, in part, working objects is emphasized by Stubbs's repetition of the animal groups at the far left and far right in the frieze-like composition of Rockingham's mares and foals, not fowls, I mix up our animals, mares and fowls, for a similar subject with a landscape ground, probably painted for Viscount Middleton, seen here, and further repetition of that same group in yet another painting from 1764. That most patrons saw this initial stage that Rockingham had appreciated of isolated motifs by genre was actually unsatisfactory or unresolved is clear from the later history of one of the paintings from that Rockingham group, the black stallion Samson, portrayed from three angles, a very anatomical approach, recorded by Humphrey as without a background in the 18th century. It acquired a dramatic kind of autumnal Loranian horizon and foliage sometime after Rockingham's death in 1782. The landscape is certainly not by Stubbs, though we can't be sure, at least I'm not sure of who the landscape painter might have been. I don't know of examples in which Stubbs's grounds, the kind of reverse story, would have taken place, but there are certainly other examples by other artists, an entire group of totally unpopulated, beautiful, eerie, open landscapes by Udry, drawings at Arcueil, were later added to with figures such as this by the painter Boilly in this case. This brings us, of course, back then to the curiosity with which we began, an incredibly extreme example, the composite Stubbs, Vernet, and Boucher, next to what I would speculate it looked like early on when Stubbs had finished it, and likely unwittingly thereafter, for we have no direct, just to be very clear, there's no direct indication that Stubbs had any clue what later happened to his painting, but it did open up or allow others to enter. His way of working was one that, as I say in the title of my talk, was one open to this kind of collaboration. So here, those of you less familiar with these painters, evoking for you the works by these leading French painters, and indeed these were for landscape in that moment, it is Vernet, and for really any kind of figure painting in this moment, it would be Boucher. Hollyhock originated, as I said, around 1765 as a study of a yearling purchased by Lord Bolingbroke. But Bolingbroke's horse would not race until 4 years later, in 1769, when it was given the name Hollyhock. Because as far as I understand, and there are certainly people in the room who might know better than I, the unbroken yearlings that had not yet debuted at the racehorse were considered bad luck to have painted. Stubbs's finished study might have held a kind of awkward status upon completion. Having already painted 4 large-scale commissions for Bolingbroke between 1761 and 64, including this one, Stubbs may have offered it to his patron as a kind of sketch, as a gift, or even a bid for future work. Its instability, its kind of unuseful status, either on the market or for Stubbs to complete a larger work, presumably encourages reformulation almost immediately as a gift in turn. The 18th century label notes, this painting was given to Monet on his last trip to England in 1766 by Lord Bolingbroke. The Monet, this is with 2 N's, has been convincingly identified by Alistair Lang as Jean Monet, a theater impresario and an entrepreneur, a very successful one, who'd purchased the privilege for Paris's Opera Comique in 1743. He was also frequently in touch with English circles. He was an intimate of David Garrick, and Monet held deep connections to the theater where he tried to, in London, where he tried to import French theater to England without any particular success. Whether this painting was given to or purchased by Monet, or perhaps more likely Monet acted simply as an agent, is unclear. The latter possibility of him being an agent is encouraged by its provenance by 1774 with sometime Anglophile and horse enthusiast Jean Comte de Berry, the man who was responsible for brokering the legalities of his sister-in-law's elevation to official mistress to Louis XV. Boucher's death in 1770 gives us a terminus date for these additions to Stubbs's canvas because his figures, in fact, you can see, I hope, on the left, are painted over that landscape ground, to which shows actually through aspects of the girl's basket and the boy's head. And I show just a contemporary kind of comparison for you of a work by, a more conventional work by Boucher on the right. Monet's patronage of Boucher is in fact well documented, beginning with designs and costumes for his theaters. Boucher also appears in Monet's correspondence with Garrick. On March 16, 1769, Monet writes, quote, "I still have a painting of which I would like to rid myself. It was painted by Boucher 20 years ago. This painting is voluptuous, and all the same, too nude for a man of my age. I hope you will help me in selling it." Monet did not directly patronize Vernet, the landscape painter, but he did act as his agent for Sir Thomas Thornhill during this period of these 2 pendants when these were painted. Vernet's record book refers to Thornhill as, quote, "an Englishman known to Monet," and in 1765, Monet wrote to Garrick, quote, do not forget my friend, to go with Mrs. Garrick to see the 4 paintings by Boucher and Vernet at Mrs. Thornhill's residence. It seems that Monet also introduced Garrick to Vernet on the Englishman's brief visit to Paris. This is recorded in his daybook of 1765. With Stubbs's image of Hollyhock on a bare ground in hand, Monet was well positioned, therefore, it's easily imagined how he would then be a coordinator of works between 3 of Europe's leading painters in the period 1765 to 70. How Hollyhock moved from Monet to the Comte de Berry is not known, though Monet's role as an art agent, perhaps one attempting to curry favor with de Berry, provides a possibility. When de Berry's collection was sold in 1774, Hollyhock's name was omitted altogether, and I must say, the Moritz House visitors, their lack of familiarity with Stubbs in 1774 in France, similarly, Stubbs would have been completely mysterious to most French art collectors. The sales catalog describes the painting as an English horse, no author, the English horse. Monsieur Vernet made the landscape that serves as its ground. Monsieur Boucher enriched this painting with several figures and animals. This painting on canvas is all the more considerable in that three able artists have exercised their talent here, each according to his genre. It sold back to Monet, in fact. So he had gone to the Comte de Verri's collection. Monet buys it back for an incredibly low 175 livres. To give you a sense, at the same sale, a large pastoral by Boucher sold for 600 livres, and a large Vernet landscape for 2,300 livres. So clearly, people didn't really know quite what to do with this object. In a context where Stubbs was little known, and the concept of an English school only beginning to take shape, notably the French academicians are emphasized, but yet even then it doesn't find a happy home and goes back to the man who essentially created it by bringing these three artists together. Hollyhock's history after Monet, the coordinator's death in 1785, is unknown initially, but it next appears back in England, where its first author again returns to the fore, of course, back in the land of Stubbs. The Sporting Magazine of January 1803 included John Scott's engraving and described this as, quote, one of the most beautiful paintings ever seen, which I think we might now have a harder time imagining. Auctioned in 1810, it sold to perhaps its ideal collector, the Francophile future George IV, in whose collection it was described as, quote, a very curious and singular picture. While the result of its journey into France did indeed result in something singular and curious, it is also a painting that invited collaboration from others at the very level of working methods shared by different artists working across Europe, a method that operated in parts and at times even allowed for admitting other hands onto the canvas, although notably not the painters, not additions by animal painters, a genre in which Stubbs and his contemporaries conceded to Stubbs's authority. Thank you.